Not the front office. Not the medical staff who had spent weeks carefully managing the situation with precision and restraint. Not the thousands of fans who had packed the stadium for the home run derby, who had watched Shohei Ohtani step into the batter's box under the lights and do what Shohei Ohtani does, make the impossible look inevitable. Nobody saw this coming. Because the announcement didn't arrive the way these things are supposed to arrive. It didn't come at a scheduled press conference. It didn't come in a carefully worded statement released at noon on a Tuesday, designed to minimize coverage and control the narrative. It came immediately. Urgently. In the hours right after the home run derby, when the stadium was still humming with the residual electricity of what everyone had just witnessed. An emergency announcement. And the word that followed it changed everything. The home run derby had felt like a statement. That was the thing about it. Not just a spectacle, a statement. A declaration from Shohei Ohtani that whatever questions had been circling him in recent weeks, whatever quiet conversations had been happening behind closed doors about his knee and his workload and the sustainability of what he was being asked to do, none of it had reached the place inside him where the great ones keep their fire. He had stood in that batter's box and hit baseballs the way other men breathe. Naturally. Inevitably. With the casual violence of someone for whom the outer limits of human athletic achievement represent a comfortable cruising altitude. The crowd had responded the way crowds respond to Ohtani. With something that isn't quite noise and isn't quite silence but occupies the space between them. A collective holding of breath followed by an eruption. Over and over again. And then the derby ended. And then the announcement came. Dave Roberts entered the room and the reporters knew immediately that something was different. It wasn't the expression on his face, exactly. Roberts is a man who has managed through enough to maintain a surface composure that rarely cracks under the ordinary pressures of baseball. But there is a version of Roberts that the people who cover this team every day have learned to read, a version where the control is slightly too deliberate, where the stillness is slightly too constructed, where the careful neutrality of his expression is itself a signal. That was the version who walked into the room. He sat down. He placed both hands flat on the table in front of him. A reporter in the second row said later that the room felt like it did the moment before a storm makes landfall. Everything quiet. Everything waiting. Roberts opened his mouth. It was the complete opposite of what we imagined. 12 words. That was all. But in those 12 words, every assumption that had been constructed around the Shohei Ohtani situation, every careful reassurance, every routine procedure, every day-to-day evaluation, every "we're being cautious," collapsed like a structure that had been quietly undermined for weeks without anyone seeing the damage. The reporters started writing. Roberts kept talking. But the room's atmosphere had already shifted irrevocably, the way a room does when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. What he described next was not the story anyone had been told. The knee procedure, the drainage that had been announced in careful, clinical language as a precautionary measure, as a standard intervention for a standard condition, had revealed something during surgery that nobody in the organization had anticipated. The GM, Andrew Friedman, would confirm it later in language that stripped away every layer of careful organizational messaging. It wasn't just a simple knee inflammation. He said it plainly. Without the usual architecture of corporate reassurance surrounding it. Just those 8 words, delivered in a tone that made 36 reporters stop typing simultaneously and look up from their notebooks. Because Andrew Friedman does not say things like that casually. Andrew Friedman is one of the most strategically intelligent front office minds in the sport. He understands that words from a GM's mouth carry institutional weight that individual player statements don't. He understood exactly what he was saying when he said it. And he said it anyway. Which meant it was worse than they had let on. To understand the full weight of what that sentence meant, you have to understand what the Dodgers had been communicating up until that point. The organizational line had been consistent. Ohtani's knee was being monitored. Fluid accumulation was a known and manageable condition. The procedure was scheduled and controlled. The timeline for his return was clear. Everything was proceeding as expected. That is the language organizations use when they want to tell you the minimum amount of truth required to satisfy the question without giving you enough to ask the next one. And for weeks, it had worked. The questions came. The answers came. The story moved forward without tipping into genuine alarm. Then the surgery happened. And something was found that didn't belong to the story they had been telling. Friedman's 8 words, it wasn't just a simple knee inflammation, were not a slip. They were not a moment of emotional candor from a man caught off guard. They were a decision. A deliberate choice to acknowledge, in the plainest possible language, that the gap between what had been communicated and what was actually happening was a gap the organization could no longer maintain. The specific nature of the abnormality found during surgery has not been fully disclosed. That is not unusual in these situations. Medical privacy laws exist for players the same as for anyone else, and organizations have legitimate legal reasons to limit the clinical detail they share publicly. What has been disclosed is the category of what was found, and the category is significant enough to explain both Roberts' 12 words and Friedman's 8. What the surgical team encountered when they went in to address the fluid accumulation was not limited to the fluid. There was something additional. Something that the imaging done prior to the procedure had not fully captured. Something that, when the surgical team saw it directly, changed the nature of the conversation happening in that operating room. Sources familiar with the situation described the moment when the surgical findings were communicated to the Dodgers front office as one of genuine shock. Not the managed, controlled shock of people receiving news they had prepared themselves to potentially receive. The shock of people encountering something they had genuinely not considered. That distinction matters. Because the Dodgers' medical staff is excellent. Their imaging technology is state-of-the-art. Their preparation for every procedure involving their most valuable player would have been, by any reasonable standard, thorough. And they were still shocked. Roberts, when pressed for detail in the press conference, did something revealing. He answered the question about Ohtani's condition not by describing the condition but by describing his own experience of receiving the news. He said, "I've been in this game a long time. I've sat in a lot of rooms and heard a lot of things about a lot of players. This one was different." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The reporters in that room, the ones who have sat across from Dave Roberts through pennant races and World Series runs and every manner of organizational crisis, understood that what they were being told was not a specific medical diagnosis. What they were being told was a scale. A sense of magnitude. A calibration from a man whose calibration they trust. This one was different. Outside the press room, the mood among the players was one that a clubhouse insider described with a single word: quiet. Baseball clubhouses are not quiet places by nature. They are ecosystems of noise and movement and the particular energy of men who spend more time together than with their own families, who communicate in a language of teasing and physical humor and the kind of shorthand that takes years to develop. They are alive in a way that most workplaces are not. On this night, the Dodgers clubhouse was quiet. Players who were asked about the announcement gave the brief, careful answers of men who are still processing something and don't yet have the language to discuss it in public. Several declined to comment entirely. One veteran, who asked not to be named, said simply, "We all feel it. You don't need to say what it is. Everyone in there feels it." What they were feeling was not just concern for a teammate. What they were feeling was the particular weight that descends on a team when the architecture of everything they have built toward is suddenly revealed to be sitting on shakier ground than anyone knew. The timing of all of this is what makes it hit differently. The home run derby. The midsummer showcase. The moment in the baseball calendar that exists specifically as a celebration, as a break from the grind, as an opportunity for the game to present its best and most spectacular to the widest possible audience. Ohtani had delivered exactly that. He had stood in that box and performed in the way only he can perform and given everyone in that stadium and everyone watching on screens across the world exactly what they had come to see. And then, within hours, the emergency announcement. The contrast is almost too stark to absorb. The image of the ball leaving his bat and climbing into the night sky. And then the image of Robert sitting at that table with his hands flat and his expression too controlled and his 12 words landing in a silent room. One story ending. Another beginning. And nobody sure yet what the new one means. Andrew Friedman, before he left the press area, was asked one more question. A reporter near the back of the room asked what the Dodgers' plan was going forward. Not specifically, the reporter was experienced enough to know a specific answer wouldn't come, but in general. In principle. What does the organization do now? Friedman looked at the reporter for a moment before answering. There was something in that pause that said more than anything that came after it. He said, "We're going to take care of Shohei. That's the only plan right now. Not the pennant race. Not the playoff positioning. Not the rotation or the designated hitter spot or the ERA or any of the 1,000 calculations that normally govern every decision a front office makes in July. None of that. We're going to take care of Shohei." Somewhere on the other side of the building, away from the press rooms and the cameras and the reporters and the organizational spokespersons carefully managing the flow of information, somewhere in the quiet of a medical area or a private room or a corridor that the cameras hadn't reached yet, Shohei Ohtani was processing the same information that had just sent shockwaves through an entire sport. He is not a man who processes things publicly. He never has been. His composure under pressure is one of the qualities that separates him not just from other baseball players but from most human beings. The ability to carry weight without showing the carrying. To absorb and continue. To be, on the surface, exactly what the moment requires while somewhere beneath the surface doing whatever it is that great athletes do with the parts of reality that can't be swung at or thrown away. What he was doing with this particular piece of reality, nobody outside a very small circle could say. But the footage would come out. It always does. And when it came, Ohtani walking, moving, his right leg taking each step with the careful deliberateness of someone who is managing something they would rather not be managing, the people watching it would look at that leg and remember Robert's 12 words. It was the complete opposite of what we imagined. Tonight, the Dodgers have a player who hit baseballs into the night sky and made tens of thousands of people feel something they will remember for the rest of their lives. They also have a GM who used 8 words to dismantle weeks of careful organizational messaging. A manager who sat at a table and told the truth in the plainest possible way. A clubhouse that is quiet when it should be loud. And somewhere at the center of all of it, the eye of a storm he didn't ask to be in the middle of, Shohei Ohtani. Taking the next step. And everyone watching to see what it costs him. The surgery results are in. The abnormality has been confirmed. The full picture is not yet clear. But tonight, for the first time, the Dodgers stopped pretending it was simple. And that changes everything.